Hey, welcome to our Google Apps Script introductory course. My name is Laurence. I'm going to be your instructor for this course. I come to you with many years of web development experience, as well as many years of Google Apps Script experience, and I'm ready to help you learn more about Google Apps Script. I am a Google developer expert, and I really do enjoy working with Google Apps Script. So what is Google Apps Script? It's a rapid application development platform that makes it fast and easy to create business applications that integrate with the Google Workspace. So if you're using G Suite, or if you want to get started with using more of what G Suite and the Google services has to offer, then Google Apps Script is the place to be. You write code within modern JavaScript. So if you are familiar with JavaScript code, it's going to be really easy to pick up and start writing code with Google Apps Script. You can also access and take advantage of the built-in libraries, access all of your favorite Google Workspace applications like Gmail, Calendar, Drive, Docs, Sheets, and a whole lot more. The best of all, there's nothing to install. It's free. All you need is a Google account, log into your Google account, and get coding. So Google Apps Script can allow you to increase your productivity, automate your tasks, and automate some of the stuff that you're doing within your Google services. You can add custom menus, dialogue, sidebars, have custom functions and macros within Sheets, publish web apps as web URLs, either standalone or embedded within Google Sites, creating standalone or bound applications. Also interact with the other Google services such as YouTube, AdSense, Analytics, Maps, connecting to the various Google APIs, build add-ons in order to extend what can be done with Google Docs, Sheets, and other Google services. And best of all, it's really easy to get started with. And now, more than ever, there's a more powerful new IDE that lets you do even more and increase your productivity, making coding even easier, debugging and updating and writing your code. In the upcoming lessons, I'm going to be walking you through some of the basics of coding with Google Apps Script, and as well as we're going to be running through what's new and improved with the IDE, the online editor for Google Apps Script. So let's get started coding and checking out some of the amazing things we can do with Google Apps Script. Hey, in this lesson, we're going to be providing a quick overview of what Google Apps Script does and what it is and how you too can get started with Google Apps Script. So first of all, you do need a Google account. So you can go ahead and log into your Google account, and to open up the Google Apps Script editor, there are a few options. So you can either open it up and by going over to google.com/script/start and hit the start scripting. So that's going to open up the Apps Script project area. And from here, you can select new project. And this is going to open up the new IDE so that you can start scripting. As well, you can go into your Google Drive, and there's that new project that we just opened up. So this is going to sit within your Drive if you are using a standalone project, and that's the ones that are not connected directly to Google Suite Apps service. So this one is going to be standalone, and it's got the indicator here with the arrow pointing to the right-hand side. So that's the logo for the Apps Script that you're going to see within your Drive. And when you give this project a name, you can give it a name, and that's going to show up as the file name within your Drive, and then that way you can easily access it. So the other way to create a new Google Apps Script project is open up the Drive, and then within the Drive, hit New, and under New, More, and select Google Apps Script. So this as well is going to open up the Apps Script editor and allow you to create another new project. So just give it a rename. And always when you are selecting names, select something that makes sense so that's easier to access and that you can always go back to it and find it within all of your projects. And this as well gets created within the Drive. And then the third way to start and creating code within Google Apps Script is to work with a bound script. So bound scripts are available within Docs, Sheets, and Slides. So let's open up a bound script within Google Docs. And the difference between the standalone script and the bound script is that the Google service, so in this case Docs, is going to be serving as the main container for the Google Apps Script. So within your Drive, you're going to see it created as a Docs file. And in order to access the Apps Script, you have to open up the dock and then go to Tools and select under the Tools Script Editor, and this is going to open up that same IDE. Now it's not creating a separate file because this is contained within the docs, and this is going to be as a bound script. So there are some advantages to bound scripts, that we can interact with the docs active content as well as we can interact with the docs UI. Whereas when you've got a standalone script, then you need to connect to the Google service that you want to use, and you don't get the same options with the UI. So it depends on the project that you're creating. If you're looking for having interaction directly within the doc, the sheet, or the slides, and you want to add menu items, then create a bound script. So that's creating either the doc, the sheets, or the slides, and then going into the tools option and script editor, and then accessing the app script that way. Or if you are just creating an automated project, you can as well connect to any one of the docs, sheets, slides, and any number of the Google services and do the same coding that you're doing within the bound script. So other than that, the similarities are the same, that the editors are going to work the same way. It's just you've got some added functionality with a bound script. So let's give this one a name of tester3 and just rename that. And so that's still going to be contained within the drive, within the doc. But if we go over to the main app script home, and if we go to the newly created projects, you're going to see that you do have tester 3. We have test 1 and test 2. And this is going to open up the same IDE. So this is going to allow us to open up the IDE that way as well. So once we've created the script within the doc, we can access it within the script.google.com site, and this is going to give us a listing of all of the projects that we currently are working on. So let's do a quick recap of what we've covered in this lesson. So we saw that we can create a standalone script. So a standalone script is any script. It's not bound to Google Sheets, Docs, Slides, or Forms file or sites. These scripts appear among your files in your Google Drive. So just as we saw here, they just appear as separate files in the Google Drive. And the creating of the standalone script, so the number of ways that you can create the standalone script. And this gives you more information about what you can do with the standalone scripts. So with the bound scripts, so these are container bound scripts. So as we saw with the docs, so these can be created in Google Sheets, Docs, Slides, Form files, and it's created in the document rather than a standalone script. And that's why for the bound scripts, it's referred to as a container and a script as being contained within the doc. So that's why within your drive, you're not going to see a separate script. But if you do go to all of the scripts within your script projects, you will see the doc listed there. And that means that there's a bound script contained within that doc. And once you do create a bound script, so one of the disadvantages is that they cannot be detached from the file as they are bound to that file. And they gain few special privileges over the parent file. So there's something to keep in mind when you are creating a bound script, so that it's always going to be attached to that file. And they do have special methods. So they do have a listing here of what the bound scripts can call, a few methods that the standalone scripts can't. So it's got the get active sheet, get active document, get active forum, and the get UI. So this is adding in to the UI menu of the particular document. There's also within Sheets, it's got some added options where you can get the active range and the selected areas. And within Docs, you can get where the cursor is positioned. So it gives you some more additional options. And there's also options for, same as with the UI, where you can create menus, dialogues, and sidebars. So go ahead and log into your Google account and create a script, create a bound script as well as a standalone script, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson. We're going to look deeper into what we can do with Google Apps Script. Google Apps Scripts allows you to increase the power of your favorite apps. So this is a listing of most common apps used. So Calendar, Docs, Drive, Gmail, Sheets, Slides. So if you are a Google Apps user, you're going to really power up your Google Apps and also automate with Google Apps script. So there's a lot of resources and documentation over at the developers.google.com/apps-script. So listing of code examples and also more details about how to work with Google Apps Script. There's a lot of guides, so rich guides that will detail all of the different methods and all the different wonderful things that you can do with app scripts. So you can create and add custom UI options, so menus, dialogues, and sidebars, and that's with the bound script. You can also write custom functions and macros within Google Sheet. You can publish web apps, so those are standalone web applications that you get a URL that you can share with others, and that's going to be all driven with Google Apps Script. You can interact with various Google services, and there are a lot of Google services to interact with. So if you're using AdSense, Analytics, Calendar, Drive, Gmail, and Maps, you can easily connect these together and log things out into Sheets and so on. And building add-ons to extend what you can do with Google Docs, Sheets, Slides. So with to increase your personal productivity, you can update and create custom add-ons and also create add-ons for the marketplace. And you can also streamline the Google Chat and also convert an Android app into an Android add-on so that it can exchange data with the user's Google Doc, Sheet, and mobile device. So a lot of really cool things that you can do, and whether you're creating a standalone script or a bound script, so that's going to be driven by what exactly you want to do with the script. So I'm going to provide a quick overview in this lesson about where to get information and get additional details, help within the, and this is the place to go to the developers.google.com. So they do have a lot of code examples, and as well, if you want some sample codes, there's a samples here within the menu, so you can select the app script samples. So it's got a lot of really neat samples that you can try out and go through. And as well, if you want to check the reference, so if you're looking for a particular Google service or a method class, so you've got a listing of all the common workspace services such as Calendar, Contacts, there's Docs, Drive, Gmail, Slides, Spreadsheets. So these are all the common workspace services, and if you unclick these, this is going to provide you the Google class and also an overview of what this particular class does, and then a listing of all of the wonderful methods that provide that power within the Google Apps Script. So these are all methods that are available, and it's got a brief example as well as a listing of what is available within the methods. There's also Google Advanced Services. So these are some more advanced functionality that you might be looking for within Google. So you can even connect to the YouTube API using the Google Apps Script, connecting to your calendar. So this is a more detailed action on the calendar itself, and also some of the more common Google services that are available, so the advanced services. And then there's also script services. So script services provide you advanced and added functionality within the script itself. So this is where you can create web apps and templates for the apps, also communicate from the client side back to the server side. There's also things like the charts that you can generate, card services that you can create for add-ons. There's different services like the cache base service, so the logger for debugging. Now we've got the console log as well. So if you're a JavaScript developer, the code is going to be pretty much the same as what you're writing with JavaScript, other than you've got access to all of these functions and methods that are available within the Google classes. So you're really bringing in a number of classes and then providing functionality through those classes by passing through data. And a lot of the common stuff that you can get with JavaScript is also available, such as date, random, and a lot of the different methods that come with JavaScript are available within Google Apps Script. So it's got a listing of these as well. There's also the UI option, and this is for the bound scripts that you can update and create menus. And they've got a basic mail function. So this is slightly different than the Gmail, because the mail app allows you to really easily send emails. So this is the syntax for it. So you can do a mail app, send email, and this will send an email to the email address that's specified here. And as well, it's going to have a reply to option and subject option. So most of the methods here, they do have code examples, as well as how to use them and how to implement them and what the parameters are. So in this case, it's expecting a string value. So we've provided a string value, or in the example, they've provided a string value. The reply to, the subject, and the body, they're all string values. And you can also send HTML emails. Within the optimization, there's also properties service. So this allows you to store content. There's a URL fetch. So this is just like the JavaScript fetch that allows you to fetch different web content and web page content. There's the script service. So this is the one that provides you the access to different service scripts, such as running different triggers. You can set up triggers, and the triggers are used for the automation. There's also a number of utilities. So the utilities are just useful methods that help you do some conversion, encoding, decoding, formatting, JSON manipulation, and just different miscellaneous tasks. So there's a lot of options here within the reference. And this is where you're going to find most of the information that you need under the reference tab. There's also a samples tab. There's a support tab. So this gives you information on what the latest updates are. There's also a community area, issue tracking, and Stack Overflow connection there. So you can go out to there and also search for different code snippets as needed. Within the add-ons, so it tells you how you can create add-ons and how you can work with add-ons within the Google services. There's also the AppScript API service, so to give you more information about what you can do with the REST API and creating different REST APIs for your projects. So before the next lesson, so head over to the developers.google.com and check out some of the sample code as well as the reference and the guides area. And you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson. We're going to dive into the editor and the functionality of the editor. This lesson, we're going to be writing some code with Google Apps Script. So let's go over to the script.google.com/home/projects and hit the new project and create a brand new project. I'm also going to increase the size of the editor so that's easier to see while I'm doing the recording. Now, of course, you don't have to do this. You can keep the size as desired. So we're just going to give this one a name of tester script. And that's the way that's going to show up within the drive. You can also go over to your drive and just make sure that you do have the script there available. And we're going to be writing some script. So this is the IDE. You can minimize and you can make the file area larger and smaller. There's some numbers, and we're going to be going over all of the options with the IDE in the upcoming lessons. So this lesson was just to create our first script. So the way that Google Apps Script works is you've got a series of functions, and then you have an option to run the various functions, and this is what provides the script functionality. And this is just like JavaScript within the cloud. So if you're familiar with JavaScript, then you should be pretty good to write Google Apps Script. So let's create, and let's just use this first function and give the function a name. So just call it myFunction1, and we're going to run through some of the functionality that's available. So in this function, what we want to do is we want to create a doc. So giving a variable name, and I'm going to just call it doc. Now, of course, you can call it whatever you want. This is just a regular typical variable. I'll make this one size bigger, so we're at 200%. And then using the document app service class, so we can select it from the menu. And there's also within the I, it'll give you more information about what's available. So this is within the document app. So let's go ahead and select the document app. And then when we create, so when we do the dot, it's going to provide us the menu option with all of the different methods that are available to us. So what we want to do is create a doc. And the parameter that is required here is a string value, and this is going to be whatever we want the name of the doc to be. So we'll call it test1, and then go up and save the project. And now we're ready to run the project. So let's run the project. And within the execution log, so this is going to give you information about what's happening behind the scenes, the server as it's running the function. And it is going to ask us for permissions whenever you're accessing, or whenever your script is accessing any additional functionality or any of additional services that you have. So whether it's accessing the drive or the doc or the sheet or any of the other Google services, you're going to have to provide permissions for it. So you can always as well remove the permissions that the script has to your account. So let's select the review permissions. And first it will ask you to sign into a Google account that you want to use. And in this case, I'm just going to be using this default one that I'm also creating the script with. We can also just continue to the script. So let's select the account that we want to use. And because this app is one that we're just creating, we get this warning message that Google hasn't verified this app, and it's requesting to access Google account information. And until the developer actually verifies the app, it shouldn't be used. So this is a warning message that you're going to see on all of the apps. You have an option here to either go under advanced or back to safety. Back to safety will just boot you back to the IDE, and it won't actually let you run the script. So if you do want to run the script, then you have to go through the advanced, and here it's going to allow us some more details about what permissions we're accepting. So continue only if you understand the risks and trust the developer. And because I am the developer of this app, so I'm pretty good with this, and go to the test script. So this is going to be corresponding to the name of the script. So we've got the tester script, and that's also the name that we were using. So let's select that. And now it's going to tell us what permissions the script is asking for, and it's going to run as this user account. It's going to allow us to run the test script, so the test script content, and it's asking for the view manage your Google Docs documents. So that's the set of permissions that it's requiring, because we're using the document app class and we're accessing the Google Docs documents. So we also have some more details here about the various risks that we're taking. And if we ever want to remove the permissions, you can always open up the Google permissions, and that's going to give you a listing of all of the permissions that you've got. So that one actually didn't run. So let's stop it, and we'll try to run it one more time, and we'll run through the permissions quicker this time. So under advanced, and that's because I clicked off on the Google account. And once you're okay with the permissions that you're providing, hit allow. And now this will actually execute the application. So we've got the notice, so the time that the application executed and when it was completed, so what happened. And when we go over to our drive, we've created a brand new file, and whatever name we had within the, whatever name we had here, so we have test1. We created a brand new document with test1. So there's the document that we created, and this one's a blank document. So let's create another function. And this one can be my function 2. And this time we're going to create another document, but we're going to write to that document using the Google Apps script. So now that we've assigned a variable, and because the document app create has a callback of the newly created document object, we can now reference it with the name of doc. So we select doc, and we've got the drop down of all of the available methods that we have. And within the doc, we want to write some content to it. So we're going to get the body of the document, and that's going to get it as another object. So a lot of times you're going to see that we've got another object for the document body. And if we use the log, that's for debugging, so we can output those objects. And this in itself will just be a document object. So we want to write to some content into it. So let's select the new body object, and here we've got some options. So we can append a horizontal rule, we can append an image, a list item, a page break, a paragraph, or a table. So these are some of the basic structures that we can add to the document. I'm going to do an append paragraph, and within the append paragraph, it does require one parameter, and that's going to be a string value, the content of the paragraph. So let's do a hello world as the content of the paragraph, and then save that, and we're going to run function number 2. And we've already accepted permissions for the document app, So we're able to run that without having to accept permissions again. So once you accept permissions, you can run it, and those permissions are going to be persistent. You can always remove the permissions by going over to the myaccount.google.com. So that's going to list out all the apps and allow you to remove permissions. So let's head on over to Drive and see what we've got for test 2. So there's test 2, and there's some content within test 2. So once you create the document, so every document within Google has a unique ID. So the ID value, and the easiest way to select the ID is just go up to the URL of the document. So if we want to not create documents, but simply select existing documents and append a paragraph or write to those, we can do that as well. So going over to test 1, the one that we originally created, we're going to select the ID from the web URL, go back over to our project, and let's create one more function. And this function can be myfunction3, so that it's in line with other function names. And this time we're going to use the ID of the document. So assign a variable name, give the ID for the variable name. And I'll move this up a little bit so it's easier to read. And now this time, instead of creating a doc, instead of using the create doc function, we're going to take the const and assign a variable doc. Now you don't always have to use doc, of course. You can use any variable name that you want. So selecting the document app class, and we want to open by ID, and the parameter that it's expecting is the ID value. So let's just drop the ID there. And I'm also going to use the logger log, which is the same as the debugging tool. So you can also, if you're familiar with console log, it's the same idea where it's going to output content into the log, and the log's what you see when you execute the app. So let's try that, and we'll do a myfunction3 and we'll execute it. So we selected the document object, and next let's select the body. So the same way that we did here where we've got the document object and the body. And let's run that one more time. So now we've got the document body section. So we're at the same state that we were here when we were creating it. And now let's take from the body and we'll copy that function, and we're going to append a paragraph. And you can also get the callback on the paragraph as well. So let's output the paragraph here and run function3. So it's got a paragraph object. And now if we go over to test 1, there's our newly created paragraph using the Google Apps script. So whatever we want within Hello World, let's run that one more time and go over to the doc1. So there's our Hello World 2. And whatever times you run it, it's going to continuously add new paragraphs. And once you've selected the paragraph object, there's also different methods that are available for that. So when you select the paragraph, you can append some additional text to it. So let's add in some new text and use the append text method and run that function one more time. So there's our newly appended text there, and it's rich with a lot of different functionality that you could do. So the idea is that you either create the containing Google service that you want to use. So in this case, we're using the doc, or you select an existing one and then you can manipulate it. So once you've selected it, select the body content, and then you can update the existing content, and you can add new content to it. So coming up, I'll go through a few more classes with Google Apps Script. In this lesson, we're going to be creating some additional example code. So let's open up the editor, and we'll use the same file that we were using the last time. So this time we'll call and create a brand new function. So call it myfunction number 4, and got to prefix it with function. So that indicates that we're expecting a function here, and by the name of myfunction4. So we can select that. Now with the Google services, there is a way to get whatever the active user is. So we're currently using an active user, and that's how we log into the Google Apps Script and are able to create Apps Script. So in this case, this is my email address that I'm using. So I'm going to send myself an email using Google Apps Script. So first of all, I need to get the email address, and there's a way to get it from the session service. So selecting the session service, and this gives you a drop down of some of the options that you have. So you can get the user, you can get the active user. So selecting the active user is going to return back the active user information and gets the user's email address, so the get email. And if this is allowed within your security policies. Now, if you are using the Google services, if this is company-based Google services, sometimes the admin might lock down some of the options within Google Apps Script. So keep that in mind. And I'm just using a regular Gmail account. So this is just a regular Google account, a free account. So I do have access to it, but if you don't see that option to get the email, that's because the administrator has locked it down. So what is being returned here is going to be the active email address. And if you want to see that email address, you can do a log or log. And it's always a good idea as you are writing scripts to make use of the logs, because this will give you information about if you've actually got a variable and also help for debugging. So let's run the function number 4 and we'll get the current email address. And we do have to provide permissions for this as well. So let's just go through the accepting the permissions as we're adding in additional permissions to the tester script. So selecting and adding in permissions, it's going to allow us to get the email address. So it outputs it as a string value. So once we've got the email, we can send ourselves the email or an email to that account. So let's select the content of the email, and we can do that by actually, let's send the content of the Google document that we created in the last lesson, and we'll send it via email. So once again, using the ID of the doc to reference the document, we're opening it by ID and it's being returned back into the variable name doc. And then we're getting the body object of the current doc by selecting the body content. And if we do a log of the body content and run the function, we're going to get this document body section. So we need to turn the body, and we want to edit as text, and then selecting the method get text is going to return it back as text object. So let's run that, and there we've got our text object. So we've got some content that we can send in the email, and also we want to get maybe the name of the doc. So that's another thing that we can get, and I'm just going to actually add and select that as email content, set a variable name for the email content, as we're going to need this for the email itself. And we also need a subject for the email. So let's use the logger log, selecting the document and get the name of the document. So that's going to return back the name of whatever the current document is that we've selected with that ID. And that was named test1. And just as we get the name, we can also set the name. So if we want to update this to my email doc or whatever we want to call it, we can also set the name. So that's going to rename the document. So now it's called my email doc. And at this point, it was still test1, but if we run this function again, now we've got the new name of the document. So we can set a name, we can get a name of the document. So we've got all of the information we need to send an email. We've got the email address, we've got some content for the email, and we've also got a subject for the email. So let's select and create a variable called subject. And this will just be whatever the doc get name is. So whatever that returns back, it's going to return back a string value for the name. And if we also want to get the URL, we can also get the URL of the document. So we don't have to open up the document as long as we've got the ID. We can select the document, and just as we got the name, we can get the ID, and we can also get the URL. So it's going to return back the URL of the document. So let's take a look and see what we've got here within the log. So there's the URL of the document, and we're going to send all of this information in an email. So let's create one more function here and call it URL and assign a value to the doc. And putting it all together to send an email, we're going to use the Gmail app service and the method send email. And it gives you an example of how to send the email. So it's expecting the recipient, which is a string, a subject, which is a string, and a body, which is a string. So it's the values, the parameters that it's expecting. So let's add those values in. So it needed an email, it needed a subject, and it needed an email content, which is the string value that we were using. So email content, which corresponds to there. Now we can also update and add to the email content. And I do need to update this instead of a const to change it to let, because we're going to be updating the contents of the email content. So I'm just going to concatenate to it whatever the value of the URL is. So adding in a space, so it's not right together, and there's our URL. So let's put it all together and what this function is going to do. So function 4, it's going to get the email address of whatever the active user is, and the active user is coming from the session class, and the session class is what is created whenever you log into your Google account. So you don't have to always log it out, but we were doing that as debugging. We had a document that we created, so we've got an ID value for the document that's sitting within our drive. We've selected the document by ID into the doc object, and then we're using the doc object. So first here we're getting the body content, and we want to get the body as text instead of an object. Otherwise it'll just send the object class name. So selecting the body, we're using a method to edit as text, and that allows us to select the content as text. And then here we're setting the name, so in case it's not the right name, whatever name we want to set. And this we've already done, so we can actually skip over this step. So just like with JavaScript, you can comment out blocks, lines of code with // and then we're setting a variable name called subject, which is going to be the name of the doc. We're also selecting and getting the URL and updating and appending that to the email content. So whatever content is currently within the doc, then that's the content of the email that we're sending. So it's just a string value that we're sending. And then lastly, we've got the Gmail app class, which is providing the method of send email that required a few parameters that we've picked up and we've dynamically generated the content for. So save that and let's try running the my function. So run the function, and of course we do need to accept permissions because we're using the mail app service. So we haven't accepted permissions for that yet. So whenever you add different permissions, then you do need to always accept those. And right now we're adding in the read, compose, send, and permanently delete email from the Gmail. So that's the permissions that we're adding, and that's going to allow us to send the email. So it looks like everything executed properly. Let's go over to our Google Drive. And of course, every time you're accepting permissions, you get a security alert that will give you more information about that the tester script was granted access to your Google account. So this is just a security feature within Google that every time you accept and grant permissions, you're going to get an email. And then here's the email that we sent. So let's check it out. And within the email, we've got hello world 2, hello world 2, new text, and then we've got a link to the doc, and then we've also got it as an attachment. So this is a feature, and this wasn't actually anything that we did. It's whenever you're sending a Google Gmail, it automatically will add a doc as an attachment if it's a doc within the drive. So let's select and open that up, and we can see that the text, in fact, does match exactly the text that we have. We even have the space here up at the top of the email. So it's gotten the content of the doc as text, sent it as an email, and also we've got the URL of the doc, and we've sent that and attached it to the text of the email. So go ahead, try it out, and you can do some different variations and also try out some of the other methods that you see within the dropdown. So coming up next, we'll do a run through of the editor and familiarize ourselves with how to write code within the Google Apps Script IDE. So that's coming up next. Hey, in this section, we're going to be going over what's new with the Google Apps Script editor. So the online editor has got a facelift in 2020 and going over some of the really cool features that now come with the editor. and it's made it even easier to use. It's been a huge leap forward for debugging, more coding hints, cleaned up interface as opposed to the legacy editor. Not to worry that the legacy code will still work within the new editor. So if you do have legacy code, you can easily switch over to the new editor and it should also work seamlessly. We've got some new features with debugging. Console log has been added for all of the JavaScript. Functionality to be able to copy and paste directly your JavaScript directly into Google Apps Script without throwing any of those pesky errors with console log. There's also a new command palette which provides you some really cool features and allows you to add even more keyboard shortcuts. So for more productivity and quicker coding, the debugger and logger have also had an advanced update. More information with the autocomplete. There's the right side menu, so everything is all on one page. You can switch to the editor, also see the project triggers, libraries, services, all within one cleaned up interface. Deployment has also changed. We can update and we can deploy. We can see our test deployments, and then we can manage existing deployments. Some of the really cool features that are now new with the IDE. And as well, keep in mind that the older code will work. If you do have any questions or comments, I'm always happy to hear from you. Let's get started coding. Let's get started. We're going to create a standalone script. So going over to script.google.com and creating a brand new project. And that's going to open up the IDE. And within the IDE, just at the top, left-hand side, you can select and you can rename your project. So I'll just call it new project and hit the rename button. So at any point when you've got a project, you can do a rename of the project and update it within the project title area. There's also the option to go back to the main app script area. So this app script logo will take you to script.google.com/home. So that's the main home area for the Google App Script. There's also some options here to deploy the script. There's a share option to share the project with others. And when you share the project with others, it's going to open up the typical Google script sharing and Google services sharing window with this pop-up window where you can select and add additional people. So if I wanted to select and add another person to have access to the script, we can share that with them and you can add as many people as you want. Also, you can check off the notify people and this will send a notification that this person has been added to the script. They can be added in as a viewer or an editor, and there can only be one owner for every Google file. So that's the current owner that is the owner. And if you do want to change the ownership, you'd have to go to the drive and update the permissions. In addition to that, sharing it as a viewer and editor will also allow the user that you've shared in order to be able to access the dev environment on web apps. You can also create a new project from here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and add this person as shared to the script. And then when I go into the drive, I can also update and get the same share permissions from the drive window. So there's the permissions. It's got the current owner and whoever created the file is the owner. And also over here, we've got the default person that we've added. If we want to make this person the owner, we can do it within Drive where we can make owner. We can change them to a viewer, keep them as an editor, or we can remove them entirely. There's also an option down here at the bottom to share the link. So you can set who has access. So allowing access to the link for the Google script. If you want to have the link shared with anyone as a viewer, you can do that, as well as you can set anyone as an editor to the script. So I usually do suggest that you do not share with anyone with the link, as keep it on restricted is usually the best way to go. And that way you can fully control and you know who's going to be accessing your script project. So there's also a support button up here at the top where the question mark is. So the support button, when you click that, it's going to give you links to the documentation, training, also update, terms of service, and send feedback. The documentation is going to open up the developers.google.com/apps script. So this is the website, the go-to place for everything Google Apps Script, where you can go under the guides and find out more about the different options here. With script examples, and then under the reference, so this is where we've got the core Google Web Space services. So we've got calendar, docs, slides, spreadsheets, so you can check out all the different classes there. And then there's the advanced Google services. So this is where we provide a means to use the Google API. So it's not included with the Google Workspace APIs because it's got a more advanced functionality than the regular Workspace APIs. And this is just provides you thin wrappers around those APIs. So it's not the APIs themselves. There's more information about the advanced services here. And then as well within the Google Web Space services, there's also at the bottom, there's the script services. So these are utility services that are not connected to any particular Google Workspace product. So you can use them generally across all the Workspace products to provide some additional functionality such as logging information, creating HTML, compressing data, and even more. So that's what you can select under support. There's also a training option. So this once again brings you to developers.google.com, and you can check out some example of Google Apps Scripts code examples. And then there's an updates area. So again, developers.google.com. And of course, you can always go to the main tabs here under samples or support. So it brings you to that same website. There's also an option here to switch back to the legacy editor. So this was the original editor, and this option will eventually disappear, but it allows you to switch back to the legacy editor. And if you want to switch, or if you are on the legacy editor, for most people, it should be available to switch to the new AppScript editor. So you can always switch back to the new AppScript editor as well. So there is an option to go to the legacy editor and switch back to the new AppScript editor. And the top right-hand corner just shows you the Google account that has been logged in. The new functionality, so it's the new editor, is a lot easier to read. It's a lot easier to see the code. It's got line numbers, it's got indentation, and it's got some more advanced functionality for debugging and so on. So the lines have numbers. You can also right-click to reformat the document. So in case we have some values here, and I'll just create some script here. So set a variable of a to be equal to 6, and this actually should be log, so uppercase for the log. And if, for instance, we're not aligned, we can always select and right-click. And as well on a Mac, if you press the Control and click, the left click, that's going to open up this pop-up window where you've got an option for getting definitions, going to references, and we are going to look at these. There's also peek, so we can peek at definitions and references. We can rename symbols. And just down here at the bottom, or in the middle, we've got an option to format document. And if we've made a selection, we've got an option for format selection. So what this does is this realigns it. So basically it beautifies the code so it's a lot easier to read. And this is one of the nice advancements here, that this is more like an actual editor that you might be using offline, and it's brought into the Google Cloud editor for Apps Script. So there's that formatting option where we can realign, so it allows you to automatically format. There's also some more options here where we can format the entire document. So let's say, for instance, we've got a few functions, and we want to do a formatting of the entire document. We can select that, and that's going to realign the text and the code once again, and correctly make the indents on the code. So basically it's allowing it to be easier to read. There's also for collapsing the functions. So if you've got a number of functions, so you've got a bunch of code here, And oftentimes whenever we've got a lot of code, when we're looping through it, it's easier to read if we can collapse the functions. So if we want to look at one particular function and maybe we've got a lot of content in here, we can collapse the other ones and focus in on the one that we're looking at. And this now has been provided with the new IDE as well. So the ability to make the collapse and then of course uncollapse them and expand them once again. And they also do have the standard options that we saw before. So there's typical things that you can undo and redo. So we can undo the edit. You can go back several levels, and then also the redo as well. Like you can go back a few times until you get to the current state, and then the redo is going to gray out. So when you run out of states to go back, then you're going to have it's going to get grayed out. So you're not going to have that option anymore. There's a save button, so you can save the project at any time. There's also the run option. So what the run does is this is going to run the function that's selected within the drop down here. It's going to pop up the execution log. We can also show and hide the execution log. So if you don't want to see the execution log, you can select run and in the drop down, select one of the functions and hide the execution log. So we can show the execution log as needed. There's also the option to debug. So it works the same way as run, and we are going to look at this a little bit more detail in the upcoming lesson. But for the debug, once again, you select the function that you want to run, and then you can run the debug on the function, and it's going to open up the debugger on the right-hand side. So you can also set breakpoints, and we are going to do that in the upcoming lesson. So those are the core options for the main menu. And coming up next, we're going to look at the debugging and also more about the autocomplete within the new IDE. So again, try it out, open it up and write some code and do some realigning of the code by Control-click and do a format of the document, and also make a selection and do a format of the selection, and you can be ready to move on to the next lesson. This lesson we're going to be looking at how to debug our application. So one of the ways to debug it, and especially if you're setting a lot of variables and if you're making some updates to the variables, using the logger log is an excellent option to output the current state and current value of any of the variables. And I'm going to just copy this out a bunch of times, and we can also even create a for loop for this. So just as we would with JavaScript, let's create a for loop, and we're going to run this a number of times. So while it's less than 10, increment I by 1, and then within the for loop, we'll continue to update and add to A, and then we'll output that in the logger. Let's clean this code up as well. And because this is indented within the for loop, let's make a selection and format the selection. And notice that it does indent it to the next level. Save, and we're ready to run my function. So let's first run it within the run. And within the run, we get quite a bit of information within the execution log. So anything that we're using within the logger log is being output in the execution log. And now with the new editor as well, we can use the console log. So you can take JavaScript code and write it up in your editor and copy and paste it directly within the app script, and it'll still run the same way. So it's now we're trying console log instead of logger log. So this is a method within typical JavaScript, and it actually works the same way as the logger log. So that's really a nice update with the new IDE, because now whenever we've got some straight JavaScript code, previously if we would put in the console log, it would throw an error because it was unrecognizing that method. But now that console log has been defined within app script, it makes it a lot easier to take just basic JavaScript and copy and paste it from our offline editor, from our local editor, and directly into the app script editor. And then there's also the realigning of the code. So with the debugger, we can set breakpoints with the debugger. So we saw in the last lesson that when we run a function with the debugger, we open up the debugging. There's more information if we click the Learn More, open up the tab, and then if we go to the Support Troubleshooting, this is where we can find out more information about the debugging and how to debug the application. So common errors as well, so service invoked too many times, so that's oftentimes happens. Service not available. So there's a number of reasons why service might not be available. Sometimes the Google servers will just throw an error if they're having an issue. And there's also debugging. So oftentimes when the server is not available, you might want to try the function another time, or to isolate out some of the code in the function in case you're running some really server intensive code. So sometimes that might cause that issue. There's also authorization is required. So that's if you've missed the pop-up window for the authorization, you haven't provided the correct authorization to run the code. So in case you are setting up triggers, make sure, I always suggest that you run the function at least one time before you set it to just run on the trigger, because in case you save it and then you set up the trigger and you leave, it might need still authorization. So you won't know if it needs the authorization until you've actually run the function, and that way run the function before you set it up in a trigger. There's also the access denied. So this is again a permissions thing. So in some cases you might not have permissions, and oftentimes, as you can see, there's a number of ways that permissions will throw errors within the Google Apps Script. And permissions can be anything from permissions changing on a document that you're trying to access to permissions changing in general. And then for general debugging, use the logs in order to log out helpful information as the script is executing. There's also for the status and debugger and breakpoints, shows you how you can add in a breakpoint. And what a breakpoint does is this allows you to pause the script when it hits the breakpoint at whatever line you've highlighted. And maybe if you find that one of these values isn't coming through within the log and you want to know what the value is at this current state, this is where you can set a breakpoint, and then within the debugger you can check that out. So it gives you some more information about if you are having troubles with the script, run it within the debug instead of the run, and set the breakpoints on the script part that might be problematic. So if we're outputting into the console log and we're wondering, well, why is A increasing? And maybe we've got some type of issue here where we're taking A and we're setting it to a value of 10, and then within the log, the error that we're producing is it's not incrementing, it's set at 10, so it's not changing. So we want to debug this and find out what's going on. So we suspect that the problem is somewhere after this log ran, because we started out with 6, then we got 7, 8, and then this one should be this should be 6, this should be 7, and this should be 8, and then we're incrementing A by 1, but we're only seeing 10s output from this point. So we suspect that there is an issue within the for loop. So let's set a breakpoint on this line of code, and then that way we can run it within the debugger. So the way to set the breakpoint, if you hover over the line number, you see a little purple circle in this case, and that allows you to set a breakpoint. And then now when you run the debug, it's going to tell me the different variables. So I've got a variable I is at 0, the local A is at 10 or 8, and then we've got all of the global functions that we have as well. So we don't need to look at the global. Typically you're going to run into errors on the local stuff unless you're calling one of the methods that's not available. And we see at this point it's 8. So right now it's as expected. We're going into the function, it's 8. Let's resume it. And now we see that it's gone to 10, but we were expecting it to go to 9. So we know somewhere here is where the error has been caused. And that way we can go into the script and we can say, okay, well, that's the issue here, that we're assigning a value of 10 to A. So let's comment it out. And when we do make updates to the code, it will ask us to restart the debugger. So let's restart the debugger. So right now we're at 8. Next is 9, 10, and 11. Let's also step over. And you can also do a step in and step out. So what the step in will do, and the step out, so that will step in and step out of the function of the loop, so looping it back. And now we're sitting at A is 13. Let's take a step back, so it brings us back to line number 9. And then if we step in, that's going to bring us to the next line. If we do a step over, that's going to step over that particular breakpoint, and then it's going to move to wherever, if we do have next breakpoint, and which we do because we're set the breakpoint within the loop. Also, we can resume it. So the resume will continue. So if we've checked the code and if we're not seeing any errors, and you can also resize these windows as well. We can also stop the execution of the debugger. We can get rid of the execution log as well and hit resume. And then once we've gone through all the breakpoints, so that's it. So we've run through and we've done all of the breakpoints, and we've also done some debugging of our application using the breakpoints. So that's how you can use the debug function within AppScript. And this is a really handy function that allows you to really get into the code and find out exactly what line is causing any issues that you might be encountering, and have that pop up on the right-hand side with the debugger. This lesson, we're going to be looking at the autocomplete function within the AppScript editor. And when you are writing a function or a method, it does have an autocomplete option. So let's create a brand new function, and we'll just call this test1. And then within this function, we're going to set up a document, and using the doc app. So this is the pop-up where you've got some information. So once you start typing one of the methods or one of the classes, you're going to get a pop-up window that's going to help you autocomplete. And you can also get more information about this. So this, if you want to complete it, you can just click on it. And as well, if you want to check out what additional information, it gives you what interface it's on, the namespace, so document app, and it gives you also an example of the const document app and document app value. So let's add in the document app, and then the next autocomplete is going to give you a drop down of all of the enums as well as the methods that are available for the particular document app class. So we've got an option to open it by ID, get the active document. So that's with a bound script. We can create one. So let's select create. And if we want to find out more about this, also you might have noticed as well that we've got a red curly underline here, and that means that there's something missing within the method, because create is expecting a parameter for the name of the document that we're creating. So let's add in a string value. So this can be a string value for the name. And when we do set variables, if they haven't been used yet, they're going to be grayed out. And if they are dark black, that means that they're in use. So once we set a name for this variable, we've got string name. We haven't used it yet, but we're going to use it to create the document using the string name. So copy the string name variable name. And then once we use it within the code, we're going to find that the string name now goes black. And whereas if we haven't used the variable that we've assigned, it's going to go gray. And that means that we're not using it within the code. We're not using the callback function, so we don't actually need it. It's going to be the same thing, the same idea here, that we can set the code using the doc. So if we're missing it, we do get that red underline again. And also you'll notice as well that we do have the red dot here on the right hand side. So if we do have any errors or issues, if you do save it, it will stay as underlined. And when we do create a space, you get this little light bulb here. So you can check and it will provide you fixes. Fixes you can also get under the command by selecting the area that is underlined. And on a Mac, you can press Command dot, and that will pop up this little window. Or you can select it once again, just click anywhere where it's got the red underline, and then go to the Show Fixes. And this will give you two options. So you can ignore this error message that will get rid of the red line, or you could disable checking for this file, so that will disable the automatically checking. So in this case, we know we want, and there does seem to be an error here for whatever reason, and that's because we're missing the string name, that we're not making use of it. Also, when we select the string name, we can see that it also provides us a hint that we can remove the declaration for string name because it doesn't detect that we're using it within the code. If we do and ignore the message, then the string name will go dark as if it was being used. And then also we have the option to disable checking of the document. So just using the string name here, once again, it's going to make it darker and allow us to create that document. So within the doc, let's do the drop down and see what options we've got. So we can, within the doc, let's get the body content and get the body object of the document. And here within the drop-down suggestions, we've got all the different methods that are available to us. So in this case, we want to append a paragraph. And then once again, within the append a paragraph, if we don't include value, a string value within append paragraph, it's going to have the underline. So let's add in the string, and we'll use the string name. And notice as well within the suggestions, because we've declared the variable string name, and if we start typing it, it will come up as one of the suggestions of what we can use as a value from the dropdown. So let's select the string name and save it. So run test1 function, review, accept the permissions. And what we're doing here is we're going to create a document with a paragraph that's going to also include the string name. So let's go over to the drive. There's our document that we just created, and there's the appended content into the body of the document. And you probably also noticed while I was typing, there's autocomplete here. So whenever we do the rounded brackets, it's going to give us the method, it's going to give it the definition of the method and the parameters that are required. So the new document's name creates and returns a new document. So in this case, it's returning the new document back to doc. They do have an example of how to, the syntax, so variable doc, document app.create, and then it's got a string value for the document name. So it gives you a full coding example pop-up window of what to include within the parentheses here. And in this case, we're just going to include the string name value in there and use that in order to create a document. So all of these new features where they've got the pop-up windows and helper windows that help you define and let you know what information, this saves you the trouble of having to go over to documentation and then flip back to your code where it's literally presented within your code within the pop-up windows as the autocompletes. And then as you add in new variables, they also get added into the pop-up window as an option for one of the variable names. And this really does help with if you've got a variable that you're trying to remember, or if you have a function that you're trying to run, it's going to reference that function and allow you to easily make a selection of that within the pop-up window. So these are the my functions that we created earlier. So you can select the my function and run the my functions as well within that function and easily reference any function or variable name that you have access to within the scope of the function that you're currently creating and running. So go ahead, try it out. Look from the drop-down method list of all of the things that you can do with the various functions, as well as try out what you can do with your variables. And even with a string that we've just created, it gives you all of the different string methods that are available within JavaScript. So we've got the trim, we've got to uppercase, to lowercase. So you can select from the typical JavaScript methods, string methods as well. And that's also included within the drop-down. So it makes it really easy to see what's available for each one of the objects that you're working with. In this lesson, we are going to be looking at the left-hand side menu, navigation menu. So within the AppScript IDE, they've provided a whole menu here on the left-hand side that allows you to, without losing and moving off of your project, to open up the right windows and access the content and the information about your file. So the default window is the editor window, and that's the one that we're currently on. There's also an overview window, and this will tell you information about when it was created, when it was modified, the role of the creator, the different deployments, the executions, how many times we've run that, users. And this before we'd have to go out to the main app script and we'd have to be able to select the script that we want to see. But now we've got it all within one place where we can easily just access and we can see if we've run any errors, if we have any execution problems. And this also helps for debugging. We can make a copy of the script in the information area as well. So this is really easy where we can make a copy of it. We can add a star to it. And for the star, there's a special slot here within the projects that you can see the starred projects. So if you want to add in a star to maybe the one that you're working on or some of the important ones that you've created, this is the great way to make a sorting and sort that out from the other projects that you might have. So now that I've added into the starred projects, if I refresh, I'm going to see this new project within the starred projects. There's the project, and then it also gives me the overall health and information about the project. If I refresh it and if I go out to my Google Drive, you can also see that there has been a star now added into the new project. So it is starred. And as well from the Google Drive, you can select and you can remove the star and you can add the star as well from the Google Drive. So that's one of the options that's really nice to have, that you don't have to navigate outside of your script. You don't have to change any pages. You can do that all nice and neatly within the script and get all of this information. And as well, you can remove the project. So if ever you need to go back to the editor, this is going to open up the editor where you've got all of the code that you're updating and editing. There's also the triggers on the left-hand side main navigation menu, and this will give you all of the triggers that you currently have on your project. I don't have any triggers on my project, but again, it's a nice way to add triggers and add automation to your projects. And if you do have a number of triggers, you want to be able to sort through them so you can check out and just show using a filter the different triggers. Let's go ahead and add a quick trigger to the project. So selecting a function that we want to run the test one. Deployment, where should it run? So we're just going to run it within the head. There's no other options right now. Within the select event source, so there are two different ways to add triggers, either a time-driven or a calendar event. So from the calendar, this can select from the user's calendar, and we need to make sure we add in whoever the user owner of the calendar is. Typically, we do time-driven events, so they're a lot easier to set up, and they can run on regular intervals. So time-driven, we can set either from a specific date and time. We can set it as a minute timer, hour timer, day timer, week timer, or month timer. So let's go ahead and set a minute timer. How often do we want it to run in the minutes? We can run every minute if we want, 5, 10, 15, 30. So there's a number of different intervals that we can set. And then also for the error notification, typically I do set it on notify me immediately, but if you don't want to be bombarded, if you've got a number of scripts running, you might set it to daily, weekly, hourly. So it's up to you depending on how you want the notifications to work. You can also update and add in different ways of notifying, so it can do it immediately, and as well it can have the other options, hourly and so on. And these are actually really good to have and add in the failure notifications, because ideally when you do set up a trigger, you want to kind of let it run and automatically run. So this will give you some peace of mind, and in case it's running and you want to be able to make sure that it is running. And if it's not running, if it throws an error, you're going to get the error messages. And as well within the triggers, you've got the option here where you can open up and reset the parameters of the trigger, and then you can update the project details. You can see the executions of the trigger. You can see the failed executions and the successful ones, and as well you can delete the trigger. So that's all within the left-hand side menu. There's also the executions. So this is a listing of all of the executions. So this is the ones that we've been working on, and we've seen which ones completed and which ones were canceled. We can get different details, so we can view if there's a trigger on it and so on. So this one is actually from the trigger. So we get information about the trigger execution, and in this one was just the typical execution. It kept the execution log, so you can always go back to it if you're debugging, and if you want to go back and see one of the execution logs from one of the previous executions of the script or the functions, you can see that as well in there. You can rename it. So if you want to track a particular execution and you want it to stand out from the other ones, you can rename it. And that will rename the project that the execution is being done on. You can also open up the project and project details, but it already is open here, so we don't need to reopen any specific windows. There's also with the filters, so we can check to see what type of execution it was. So you can see if it's an add-on, automation, custom function, editor, and so on. So I'm going to just select the ones that were done with the editor, and that's going to only show the ones, filter out the rest of them and show only the ones that were executed with the editor. So again, really nice to have. And the nice thing about it is if you want to get back to your code, you just click the editor option, and that's going to bring you back to the editor option. And then lastly, there's project settings. So these are settings that pertain to the entire AppScript project. So changing of these settings will not impact the existing deployment. But if you are creating an add-on, you have to update the JSON manifest here. So this is just an option to show it. There's also, you can enable the Chrome V8 runtime. You can log uncaught exceptions within the cloud logs. If you add in the AppScript JSON manifest for add-ons, you do need that. When you go back to the editor, you're going to see you're going to have the AppScript JSON manifest. So right now I don't have a whole lot here within the JSON manifest, but what the JSON manifest does is if you've got any permissions that you want to set, dependencies and so on, those can be added in here. So going back to the project settings, there's also the ID of the AppScript project. So if you ever need the current AppScript ID, you can copy it. And then you can also set your Google Cloud Platform. So if you are creating an add-on, you need to update your GCP. So the Google Cloud Platform. So you can go here and create a project and then add in that project ID here within the Google AppScript interface here within the Google Cloud project and add the ID there. So this can be done by clicking the change project. It walks you through the steps in order to change the project ID, also to set up the OAuth scope after you're creating the project. So there's some more information about how to set and create the add-ons. And then once you've created the GCP project number, you can set that here and set that as your project number. The default, of course, is just regular AppScript, and that's not going to include anything for the project. So it's just going to be using the regular GCP default project value. So try it out, check out and create a trigger, and also check your executions and any of the triggers, make some updates to your trigger. And actually I'm going to remove out the trigger because I don't want that to continuously run. This is just a testing application. Check your executions, some of your prior executions, check out the logs, and then also check what you've got within the project settings. And you'll be ready to move on to the next lesson where we're going to be looking within the IDE and the files, libraries, services, and so on. So that's still coming up in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at libraries, and they can be accessed under the Files area. So to the left of your editor screen, you're going to see a listing of files. So up top here, you can add different files. So the files options are another script file, so that's another Google script file or an HTML file. So creating another Google script file, we can add that in, and it's going to be saved as another GS file. And the nice thing about the various files is that you could use them across other files. So let's say we have a variable of value of total, and we want to use that within the V2. And you also have to make sure that you don't have the same function names, so we're not reusing the function name, because the scripts are going to be just as you would if you had multiple JavaScript files, that they're going to run one and then the second one. So you're going to be actually overwriting this function if you're already using it. So we can't have an option for the same function name. So let's set this up as my function 100. And then within here, we'll use the logger log and we'll output whatever we've got for total. So within the log, we've got the drop down for the total variable. And now let's run this function and we get the output of 1,000. So that's how we can create multiple Google AppScript files. The JSON manifest is the one that's created automatically. If you don't want to see it anymore, you can uncheck the show manifest, and that's going to be now gone from the editor. There's also an option to create the HTML files, and HTML files are typically used as client side for web apps, and in also some cases you can use them as templates for HTML templates. So a number of uses, and what this does is this just runs regular client side code. So however you're going to execute this and generate it, if you're doing a web app, you can include styling, and you can also have JavaScript code as well run in here, and then you can include these and use these within your project. So I'm not going to type any additional content here, but this is just regular HTML type content, and sometimes you can as well generate this. So it will start by a default HTML5 template, and you can generate this in your local editor and copy and paste it within AppScript. There's also the formatting here. So if we do the format of the selection, it will format it the same way that it does the Google Apps Script, that also collapsing the parents. So each one of them is self-contained and indented for the new part. There's also an option for libraries. So if you have a script ID that you want to include, you can include it as a library in your project. And I'll show you how to create a library as well. So if we want to create a library, we'd have to still deploy it as a library. And then lastly, there's also services. So there's a number of more advanced services that are available. And so these allow you to access the various Google APIs. So if you are looking to get a little bit more out of what is available within the general Google Apps Script, if you want to connect to the Google YouTube API, you can do this. And this will allow you to connect to the API and bring the Google API into the YouTube API into your project. Check the identifier, because this is how you can identify it within the Google script. So now you've got an option for YouTube, and this brought in the API, so we can check to see the various videos. We can do a search. And this is an object, so let's select under the list, and that's going to be the method that we do the search by. Let's also return back the results in a variable called vids. And then we output the results into the log of whatever we're getting back from the viz. This is one of the advanced scripts. So there's more information about it. If we go over to the developers advanced area, it's got some examples of how to make that selection. So we want to search under the ID, the snippet, the maximum results. I'm going to copy this object information out, and we'll just copy it into the script just to save a little bit of time here. So under the list method, we've got an ID and a snippet value that we're providing. We're going to look for dogs, and then we'll loop through and return back each one of the results that are going to be returned back in the items. So when we run the code, we need to review the permissions, accept permissions for our account, as we've added in new options. So view your YouTube account. And it looks like we do have an issue there because we're looking for results, and I set the variable name as vids. So let's save and run that one more time. So that's going to return back all of the found results for the YouTube video. And the APIs are really neat because you can do quite a bit with the APIs. So we can actually return back the results and use this as one of our library functions. So we're going to do that as well in this lesson. And then lastly, within the services, if you ever need to update the YouTube API, so whatever one we're using, we can make a selection of it. We can select which service we want to use. And if we open up the services, the one that we're currently using is YouTube. So that's available here. If we have to update the version, we can easily select and update the version in the drop down. So that's available under services. So let's go ahead and save this as a library. So we'll return back, and I'll create this as a function called find vids, and it will search whatever we're querying and return back the results. And then we'll, instead of outputting it, we'll return the results object. And then we can use that as a library. So what we want to do for the library is make a selection of this function that's going to sit within a new project, and I'll call it vid. And we'll reference this as vid, and I'll show you how to do that in the upcoming lesson where we're going to deploy it as a library and then bring it into another app script project. So that's still to come. So go ahead and try out the services. Add in one of the services. You can add in YouTube, do a YouTube search, and coming up next, we're going to look at libraries in more detail. This lesson, we're going to be looking at deployment and managing the deployment of our Google Apps Script. So we've given this app script a name of VID. We've created a function within one of the libraries, within one of the Google Script libraries called findvids. It's got a parameter here for the query value, and it's going to return back all of the results. So let's see if we can deploy this as a library. So the deploy option is in the top right-hand side of your IDE, and you've got a drop-down option for the deployments. You've got an option for a new deployment, to manage the existing deployments, and to create a test deployment. Since this is our first deployment, we're going to create a new deployment. Within the deployment pop-up window, you've got an option to select the type of deployment. So we can select it as a web app, an API executable, an add-on, or a library. In this case, we're going to be creating a deployment as a library that we're going to share this library to another Google Apps Script project. So within the description, let's enter in a description, and we'll call it the video finder, and hit deploy. So this is going to deploy the library, the script as a library called Video Finder within the description, and it's going to allow us to share it with others. So it issues a deployment ID and also issues a URL for the library, so where it's located. So the ID can be used within other app scripts to access that functionality that we've just created within this script. Now, it is suggested that you do try to avoid using libraries on large-scale projects, as the execution of libraries is going to be slower than the execution of the script that's native within the app script. So it's best to create additional Google Script files that you would copy and paste into your projects for larger scales projects. So this is just for demonstration purposes of how to use the library. So go ahead and copy the deployment ID, and then hit done. And under the deploy button, now that we've created a deployment, we can hit manage deployments, and it's going to give us a listing of all of the active deployments that we have. So we've got a version 1 deployment, the date, the time when it was deployed, the description of the deployment, and here again we can access the ID and the library. It also gives us some information so we can let other people in groups to use the project as a library and share this project with them. So let's go ahead and we can cancel, and we're going over to the Google Apps Script, and we're going to create a brand new script and using Google Sheets. So creating a blank spreadsheet, and give this spreadsheet a name. I'll call it YouTube list. Under Tools, hit the Tools script editor to open up the IDE. And this is opening up a brand new IDE, and we're going to bring in that library into this project and just give it a name, call it new proj. Let's go back to the first script that we've deployed as a library, get the ID, so the unique ID that we've got within the web app URL, and just copy the ID out there. And then for the library, click the plus sign, the add library option will pop up. Paste the ID of the library into the script ID, hit the lookup, and that will pop up the library information. So if you've got different versions, you can select the version that you want to run. I'm going to run version 1. And when we deployed it, when we go under the manage deployments, we only just have the version 1. So that's corresponding to the library. The identifier that we use, so this is the identifier, and the identifier is how we reference the library within the project. So if we want to reference it under VID, we can just use the vid prefix in order to reference that library. So now we've got the library listed on the left-hand side under the files, and let's create a value for results. And using vid library, it's going to give us a listing of all of the functions. So we've got the find vids, and let's look up cats. And then under logger log, we'll log out the results that were being returned back. And that should log out the results content. So we'll run the function and let the script execute. We need to accept permissions in order to access that script option. So accepting permissions, and because this is a new app that's running and accessing YouTube, it's also accessing it via this account. So let's just provide the permissions. So it's accessing the same permissions that we're using within the other project. So we did throw an error here, and that's because the service has not been enabled on this script, because the other script, it's just not just running a function, it's using the YouTube service. So you can't actually use the service from this script, even though when we were trying it, it was working. We need to also add the YouTube service into the new script where we want to use it. And select it, add the service. And we can close the execution log. So now we've got the script and the service added. And again, typically you wouldn't be using it for something like this where you're just connecting to a service in one script and then accessing it within another. So you'd probably be doing something with the search results. But again, we are trying to demonstrate the library process, so that's why we're using it this way. And as well with the results, we can ignore this message because it's got an error here, but it doesn't see that there is a callback for this function. So that's why it's throwing the error there. So let's run the my function. And now we're getting all of the content coming back from the API. It's actually coming back as fairly large, a number of different results that are being returned back. So we can also fine tune what we're returned back. So if we only want just the items as an object, we can update that script. And we have to redeploy it, so have a new deployment as we're having a new version of this library. And we'll just call it our version 2 of the library. And now going back into where we're executing the code under the libraries, let's select this library. So open it in a new tab. It gives us information about what's contained within the library. And the library itself, we can update the version. And let's just double check manage the deployments. And we'll run the function one more time. So this time we're just returning back the different objects, and each one of these objects, they contain an ID and they contain a title. So if we want to output the information that's contained within the object, we can break that apart as well. And one of these objects appears to have quite a bit of content there attached to it. Go back to the vid script, and we're going to update the value of total to 5,000, and then run through the my function again. And we're still sitting at value of 1,000, so we're not using the newer version of the script. Let's click it again. And it doesn't look like we've gotten the versions. So removing the library, and then let's select the ID again, and we'll add in the new library. And this time we should be able to see the version. So sometimes it does take a while for the script to update and do a quick lookup. And now we do have the version. Let's do another deployment. So manage the deployment and do a deployment of it. In the library, paste the script ID, do a lookup. So it looks like we don't have access to the latest version. So let's just select the head development, and that latest version will show up. So again, it does take a little bit of time. So we're logging out the results. Let's just check to make sure we've got an updated value for total, and that the results are being returned back as just all of the different results for the content, so it's being output there. Now let's add it into a spreadsheet. So select for the spreadsheet object, selecting the spreadsheet app, and getting an active spreadsheet object. And then let's get the sheet. We can select the sheet by name. So if we want to list out all of the YouTube stuff, and set the name, so selecting the name YouTube. So it's going to select the sheet object for us to use. I'll actually just rename this to sheet. And then within the sheet itself, we can append a row and selecting the data that we want to append with. So let's loop through results using for each. And each one of the elements that gets returned back, we're also going to pick up the index value and then return this back within a function. And this is where we're going to append the row of each one of the results. And let's append the row with the element content. And we can also log out each one of the elements and see what we've got for the results. So let's do a run of that. We need to accept the permissions because now we're accessing the spreadsheet object and writing into the spreadsheet. So also accessing the YouTube. So as it runs through, it's going to be now listing it out all within a JSON format. And if we want to break this back into a usable object, we can take the element and turn it into a JavaScript object by using JSON parse of the element object. And let's take a closer look and see what we've got here. So if we want to just return back the title, and also if we want so we can get the snippet information, and that's contains the title. So selecting the JS object, snippet, and title, and save that. And I'll comment out the results, and we'll only have the ones that we're outputting as we're looping through. And make this smaller. So now that's how you can get all of the titles and dynamically add it into a spreadsheet. So whatever the content is that we're searching for, and this is coming in from the other project that we've created where we've got the other app script and we're using that as a library and bringing the content into our spreadsheet within a new project. And within the deploy, you can also update and manage the deployments. You can test the deployments. So we've got the test deployments for web app, API executable, and Google Workspace add-on. So if you want to test those, if you want to manage the existing deployments, it will give you all of the deployments, so the archived ones, in the video finder. So these were the ones that were archived. If you want to redeploy an older one, you can select the deploy, and then that's going to redeploy one of the older projects that we have, or older deployments that we have, and you can always create new deployments as well. And then within the library, you want to make sure that you're using the latest version, so you can always click that and select the version that you want to use. So now we've got all three versions there. Right now we're just using the development mode, so the head version. But now we've got the version 3 there, so that was the latest one. So it does take a little bit of time to show up as one of the library versions when you make the updates. So usually give it like 5-10 minutes and it should show up within the library drop-down version option. So try it out, create a file, a Google Apps Script file as a library, and then bring the library information and make use of it in another Google Apps Script project. And you could be ready to move on to the next lesson. This lesson we're going to be deploying a web app. So a web app uses a default function, and that function name is going to be doGet. And what doGet does is this outputs the content into the web app. So the web app will automatically look for this function and output any content that's related to it. There's a number of ways to output, so 2 different services that you can use, and these are the Google script services. There's the content class, the class text output class, and as well as the HTML class. The text output just creates from the content service text output. And what you do is you return content within the doGet. You can also set this up as a variable. And this will just be regular string content that's being output. So if we want to return back hello world, we can do that. And just whatever hello world content that we want to have. And then using the content service, let's create text output. And the text output that we're creating is a string. And once again, you do see within the pop-up that it does have the reference, and it tells you what parameters are being expected within the parentheses. So whenever you start with the parentheses, it'll give you an example. And what create text output does, it creates a new text output using doGet. Here it's creating content service output, and you're appending the HTML and then returning it. So this is structured slightly different, but it's doing the same thing where we've got an output service that we're returning, and then we're adding in some content into that. So you can add it within here, or you can just append it as content that you're outputting. So there's two options for this method. There's some more information here, how to create it. So this is another example of how it's being used. And this is more in line with what our code structure is, where we've just got the string value within the create text output. So let's add in the string value into the create output and save it, and now deploy it as a web app. So go into the new deployment and select type. So select the web app type, and I'll just call it test. It's going to ask you a few questions. So execute the web app as. So this is important because if you're executing that web app, and the default is to execute it as the current account that's creating the app script, you can also get it to access the web app as the user that's accessing the web app, and then they're going to be asked to log in and authenticate the app, so providing the permissions on their account. So in some cases, you might want to try to avoid this just to make it easier for others to use. And if you are accessing something like Sheets, since this project isn't accessing Sheets, but if you're accessing any of your documents on your drive, that user that's accessing it via the web app is going to also have to have permissions to those. So it makes it a little bit more complicated when you get it to execute as the user. If you're just outputting regular text, as we're doing in this example, that's fine for them to access. But if we're accessing additional content within the drive, then it becomes more complicated because they do need to have the permissions set. Also, who has access? So you can set it up as yourself. So if you go to the web URL, you're the only one that can see the content in the web URL. Anyone with a Google account, so that means that if they're logged into a Google account, if you're part of an organization within G Suite organizational unit, that's going to be a fourth option that you're going to have here to only allow people within the organization. And then anyone just creates an open web app URL. So this means that anyone that you share this URL to, they don't have to log in. They can simply go to this web app and see the content. It's got the copy of the content of the web app. So you can copy the web URL, or you could just simply click it and see the executable content. So it's being output as hello world, and done. And now we can see the manage the deployments. So within the deployments, we've got an active one, and this active one is going to be the web app. You can pick up the web URL here once again. And there's also a dev version. So when you're developing a web app, you can go under the test deployments. And for the web app, that's going to give you a developer version. And the difference between the developer and the executable is at the end, it's going to be DEV, whereas the executable is EXEC. And the dev version is the one that if you make any changes to the code, you're going to see the changes of the code. So that's the dev version, and then this is the executable version. And as well, the dev version can only be accessed by users that have shared editing permissions to the app. So if they don't have shared editing permissions, they're not able to see the dev version. So they're not going to see anything being executed out. The other option that you have as well, and this one's a more robust option, is to output HTML content. And that also uses doGet. So I'll just rename this to old. Let's create a new function, doGet, and create a web app. So the idea is the same, that you've got some content. So let's create some HTML content. And you can include any type of client-side code here as needed. So we've got HTML, hello world, we're outputting, and then return back using the HTML service. Let's create HTML output. And now it's expecting a string value of output that's being returned. So content to serve up, and of course it does have the examples here of how to output the HTML content. And now let's run the dev version. And we've got the extension for dev there. So on the HTML service, the web URL is going to be different because it's going to redirect to the output, the HTML service output, whereas the content is just outputting as a macro that's being output directly within the browser. So there's no redirect and there's no wrapping of the application container, because this is just regular text that's being output, whereas this has the ability to run JavaScript and styling, so it allows it to run code within the browser. So that's why it's wrapped within the Google application dev environment as well as the executable environment. You can also execute and output content from a template. So that's another option. So doing the return, and we do have this HTML template here. So using the HTML service, let's create output from a file, and the file that we're using, it's expecting a string value for the file name, and we don't have to include the HTML, we can just include index. So going back out to the dev, the content that we've got output, and now this is actually coming from the file. So if we were to add in any style information, we can add that as well here and set some properties and background color of red. So let's refresh. So there's our dev background color of red. Let's deploy this web app, create a new version. This is our new and improved version with the red background. And let's refresh the executable URL. And now it's outputting the HTML. So we've got the wrapper for the HTML service. We've got it as executable. So that's the executable one that you'd share with others. And the dev one is the one that you update and you can check out and debug as you're developing the web app. So go ahead, try it out and create the web app, output content HTML, as well as using the create text output service. And you'll be ready to move on to the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be going over some of the powerful features that are available with the AppScript IDE. So one of them, and some of them we've seen that they pop up. Let's take a closer look at some of the features. So creating a variable name. So this one's going to be rather long, and I'm going to use it in a few places within the code. And then we'll make an update of the name of this value. So let's just type in a string value here that we're going to access within the code, and then make use of this function or this variable value in over here, as well as within the my function. So a number of places that we're going to be using the code, and I'll make it messy and then we'll clean up the code as well using the editor. So using the format of the document, so it's going to remove out all of and also indent that properly. So unfortunately it doesn't remove out the duplicate lines, so that's not an option yet within the editor. But you do have the option to make selections and update some of the code and values. So let's make an update of this variable. And this is one of the things that is really super useful with the new editor, that we can make a selection of a variable name and we can go to the symbol. So that will provide the symbol here and show you that it's been registered. We can also change, rename the symbol. So this allows us to rename the symbol, and I'll just call it new name and press enter. And we see that it's been actually renamed in all the instances wherever it's being used. So this saves us of having to do a find and replace of an update. And if we do want to do a find and replace of, let's say, some words, so select the content, and then you can either right clicked, control clicked, or use the F1 for the command palette. So it's going to come up and we've got an option with replace. It's also got a shortcut for this replace. So if we want to take every instance of hello and make a replace to goodbye, we have an option here as well to match whole word, match the case, and then there's also a regular expression that we can enter in. So there's a few options that we can do the replacement. It tells us how many it's found, how many instances of it, so 2 out of 3. We can also replace, and we can replace all. So we can go down to the previous one that it's found, go down to the next one, go down to the next one, and again back to the previous one. So if we want to just replace all of them, we can do a replace all, and now we've got no results that are found. So the command palette has given us quite a few options now with editing and finding and doing a replace. If we want to see where a function is being used, again, we can either do a control or right click and check to see where we go to references. And there's also the peak references. So that pops up the window where we can see every time that the my function has been used. So see it's been used twice. So there's 2 references to the word my function. We can also go to the references. So it's going to also have the pop-up window, and it's going to allow us to move and navigate to the various references of this function. And again, within the command palette, so that's either the F1, so we can add the cursor above, add the cursor below. It's got the keyboard shortcuts for the cursors. There's the main command palette option, so that's this one that we're looking at right now. So it just provides you the shortcut. Typical stuff like copy line down, copy line up, cursor redo. So those are the same as we have up here where we can redo. We can delete all, and shortcuts for doing the deletes. So it helps us to write the code better. There's also duplicate the selection, so it's a really quick way to do a copy and paste of our current selection. You can delete lines. We can expand the selection, so it's contracting and expanding the selection. We can find next. These are also done with shortcuts. They got the shortcut options. And as you learn and as you work more with Google Apps Script and you become more familiar with the shortcuts, I do encourage that you do try out the shortcuts, because it really does make the coding to be able to code quite a bit quicker. Format of document is there. Go to the bracket. Go to definition. So that's the one that's going to provide the definition. And the command palette is the one that has all of the best functionality, the advanced functionality. So you can go to the different problems. So as you're debugging, you can move through them, finding the references, finding the symbols. So what we've just done, go into the next line. And if you're debugging, this is a quick way to move through the debugging, and we can insert lines, we can replace the symbols, we can refactor it. And you can do all of this with the command panel, as well as you can do it with the keyboard shortcuts. And there's also the transform to lowercase, title case, and uppercase. We can change the hints, so trigger parameter hints, trigger suggest. So you can turn those off and on. So providing the suggest, triggering the suggest, so selecting, and if you're not seeing the suggestion, you can get a trigger and see all the different suggestions that are available. And you can also use, of course, the shortcut for that. There's also unfold all, transpose letters, show definition, preview hover. So that's the one that whenever we hover over it. You can also toggle options. And if you want to do a search, if you would just want to look for what you've got for toggle, you can toggle a block comment. So that provides you the block comment there. If you've made a selection and you want to comment out some of your code, you can do a toggle of the block comment. Let's type in the toggle, and there's also the shortcut for that. So it allows you to toggle blocks of code quickly, and then you could also untoggle it the same way. Also under the command palette, let's also check out some other toggle. So we can toggle the fold, and we don't have anything folded, so let's fold some content and select from the toggle. We can unfold all, so that will open up all of them. Again, going back into the command palette, there's also a toggle high contrast theme. So if you prefer to have a black background with light text, you can do that as well, or you can have a high contrast theme. If you want to toggle it back, You can select and toggle the high contrast theme. There's also the toggling of the line comments. So the toggle stuff allows you to customize how you've got the output of the content and how it's going to look. Tab menu focus as well, so there's toggling of that. And there's just quite a lot of options here that you can really optimize how you're writing your code and editing, debugging the content of your code. And that wasn't available within the legacy editor, so this is all available within the new editor. So try out some of the functions within the command palette to get more familiar with what's available within the AppScript IDE. And I do suggest that you as well try it out as the shortcuts as you become more accustomed to writing Google Apps Script. So as you write more code, you're going to realize that there's so much stuff that you can do. Go back over to the documentation, try out some of the samples, the different Google Apps Script samples to check out all of the wonderful functionality that Google Apps Script provides. So these are common things common apps to help improve productivity and do some automation within your Google suite of services. So check out what's available at the GitHub Google Workspace. Try out some of the code that's here. And you can even customize it to make it your own. If you have any questions or comments, I'm always happy to hear from you. Thanks again for taking this section and learning more about Google Apps Script.